There was a time when everything felt unhurried, not perfect, just steady. We didn't count days or mark milestones. Life moved forward quietly, without asking for attention, and the relationship was simply there. It wasn't something I thought about, or something I felt the need to protect. It existed in the background of my life, familiar and reliable, like something that would always remain. We often talked then about small things and ordinary moments, things that didn't seem important, and because of that, mattered the most. I never felt the need to hold on. I never worried about losing it, because I believed there would always be another moment, another conversation, another chance to speak. Time felt generous. It didn't rush me or pressure me. It waited, and because it waited, I learned to delay. I postponed conversations, delayed honesty, and assumed that closeness didn't require effort. We were close without trying, and I mistook that ease for permanence. Looking back now, I realize how quiet that period truly was. Not silent, but comfortable. The kind of comfort that slowly makes you forget to pay attention. We shared space, we shared history, and we shared familiarity, but I didn't notice how rarely we shared real presence. We were together, but often distracted, busy, tired, focused elsewhere. And yet, I never worried, because nothing was wrong. There were no arguments, no dramatic conflicts, no obvious reasons to believe something needed fixing. I believed relationships only changed when something bad happened. I didn't know they could change simply by being neglected at that time. English was very far away, not just as a language, but as an idea. It belonged to a different life, a life that moved faster and reached further. My life felt complete enough. I didn't need more tools or more words. Everything meaningful could be said in familiar language, and much of it didn't even need words at all. A look, a shared silence, a routine. Those were enough. I didn't imagine a future where distance would matter, where language would matter, where time would feel limited. We lived as if time were endless. Days repeated, weeks passed, and years slipped by without announcement. And because nothing broke, I assumed nothing was changing. We grew older, side by side, but we didn't grow toward each other. We grew parallel, and parallel lines can feel close without ever touching. I didn't see that then. I was busy living my life, handling responsibilities, and managing routines. I told myself there would be time later. Later to talk, later to explain, later to reconnect. Later became a comfortable word, a safe word, one that carried no urgency. I believed later would always come. When we spoke, the conversations became shorter, not colder, just lighter, surface level, updates instead of sharing, information instead of connection. I noticed it, but didn't question it because it felt normal. People grow busy. That's life. That's what I told myself. I didn't realize that busyness can quietly replace presence, and that presence, once lost, is hard to recover. English, again, had no place in these thoughts. It wasn't needed to maintain familiarity or survive routine. It belonged to ambition, to movement, to somewhere else. And I wasn't going anywhere. I was staying, and staying felt safe. I remember moments when something almost surfaced, a question, a feeling, a sense that something was unsaid, but I pushed it away, not intentionally, just gently. I told myself it wasn't important, that it could wait, that it would resolve itself. Relationships, I believed, were strong enough to survive silence. I didn't know that silence can also create distance. At that time, I didn't feel regret or loss. I felt comfortable. And comfort can be dangerous when it convinces you to stop noticing. We had time. That's what I believed, so I took my time. I didn't rush back. I didn't ask deeper questions. I didn't insist on being present because presence felt unnecessary. Everything seemed fine. I couldn't imagine a moment when I would wish I had paid more attention, or a time when words would feel heavy and silence would feel final. I thought relationships ended with clear signs, arguments, decisions, goodbyes. I didn't know they could fade slowly, quietly, without permission. I lived inside that assumption, and because of that, I didn't protect what mattered. I didn't cherish it. I didn't pause long enough to recognize how rare that closeness was, or how fragile time can be, even when it feels generous. English was still very far away, and so was understanding. I didn't know yet that the most important lessons do not arrive with urgency. They arrive when you believe you have plenty of time. And by the time you realize that time was never guaranteed, something has already changed. But in that moment, I didn't see it. I was still living in the comfort of later. And later felt safe until it wasn't. The distance did not arrive with noise. There was no argument, no raised voice, no clear turning point. It arrived quietly, so quietly that I didn't notice it at first. Life became busy, not in a dramatic way, but in a practical one. More responsibilities, more routines, more things asking for attention. Days filled themselves without permission, and slowly, without intention, we began to speak less, not because we didn't care, but because we assumed there would always be time. Messages became shorter. Conversations became updates. How are you? I'm fine. Enough to stay connected, but not enough to stay close. I noticed the change, but I didn't name it. Naming it would have required attention, and attention felt like something I no longer had. I told myself this was normal. People grow busy. Life moves forward. Closeness, I believed, did not need maintenance. It would return on its own. We were still part of each other's lives, just not in the same way. I didn't feel alarmed. I felt comfortable, and comfort can be misleading. There were moments when I almost reached out, almost asked a deeper question, almost said something honest, but almost became enough. I postponed. Later felt safer. Later felt easier. I didn't realize that later was slowly replacing now. When we did meet, the moments felt familiar, but lighter. We talked about schedules, about practical things, not about how we felt. I assumed we understood each other without words. After all, we had history. And history can create a false sense of security. It makes you believe connection is permanent, that it does not require presence. English, during this time, was still far away. It had no role in maintaining familiarity. Everything important felt already understood. I didn't need new words. I didn't need new ways to explain myself. So I thought. I didn't see how my silence was becoming habitual, how avoiding deeper conversation was becoming normal. Silence, once comfortable, was turning into distance. But it happened gradually, so gradually that it felt natural. I told myself there was nothing to fix, nothing broken, and I was right. Nothing was broken. It was fading. Fading is harder to notice than breaking. Broken things demand attention. Fading things disappear quietly. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The space between us grew wider, not empty, just unfamiliar. I still believed the relationship was stable, something that existed without effort. That belief kept me calm, but it also kept me distant. There were small signs of delayed response, a missed chance to meet, a conversation that ended too quickly. I noticed them, then explained them away. Everyone is busy. Everyone is tired. Life is like this. I didn't know that absence can become a problem without announcing itself. English remained irrelevant. Distance didn't require language. Silence didn't require explanation. I stayed where things felt manageable, where no difficult words were needed. I avoided complexity, not intentionally, but instinctively. I didn't know yet that avoidance was also a choice. There were nights when I thought about reaching out, about reconnecting, but I waited for the right moment, for more time, for things to slow down. They never did. Life rarely does. And while I was waiting, the distance continued to grow, not aggressively, gently, like water, slowly changing the shape of stone. By the time I noticed that something was missing, it felt too late to ask simple questions. Not because they were difficult, but because they now carried weight. I still believed we had time. I still believed things would return to how they were. I didn't see that closeness is not something you return to. It is something you remain in. And I had stepped out of it without realizing English was still far away. So were the words I would later wish I had said. At that moment, I didn't feel regret. I felt neutral. And neutrality can hide loss until it is impossible to ignore. I was living inside that neutrality, unaware that the space between us was becoming a silence that could no longer be filled easily. I didn't know yet that a moment would come when everything would become clear. A moment that would force me to see what had been happening all along. But for now, distance continued to grow quietly, and I continued to believe there was still time. The moment did not feel important when it happened. There was no warning, no sense that something was about to change. It was an ordinary day, marked by an ordinary message and an ordinary pause. I was busy, distracted, focused on something else entirely. I read the words quickly, without weight, and replied later than I should have. And then nothing followed. At first I didn't think much of it. Silence had already become familiar. I assumed it would pass, like it always had. But this silence felt different. Not heavier, just clearer. I began to notice how much space there was between messages. How long it had been since we last spoke about anything real. Not the usual updates or polite exchanges, but something that required attention and presence. I told myself I would reach out soon. Soon became later. Later became days. Days became weeks. And somewhere in that quiet stretch of time, something inside me began to shift, not panic, but awareness. I realized I could no longer remember the last deep conversation we had shared. Not the last update, not the last exchange of information, but the last real moment of connection. That realization felt uncomfortable because it revealed something I had been avoiding. Distance had not just grown, it had settled. It had become the new normal. I replayed moments in my mind, conversations I delayed, questions I didn't ask, times I chose convenience over presence. There was no single mistake and no obvious failure, just many small choices that leaned gently toward silence. I began to see how often I had assumed understanding, how often I believed closeness did not need attention. I had trusted familiarity to do the work that presence should have done. That moment was not dramatic. It didn't break me. It clarified me. For the first time, I understood that relationships do not disappear because of conflict. They fade because of absence. And absence is rarely intentional. It is convenient. That understanding stayed with me. I began to feel a quiet urgency, not panic, but something softer and more persistent. Regret, progress, the kind that whispers, if you wait longer, you may lose the chance to speak honestly. Eventually, I reached out, not with a long message or explanations, just something simple and real. The response, complete, kind, short. There was no tension, but there was distance. I could feel it between the lines. That was the moment I truly understood we were no longer standing in the same place. Not because someone moved quickly, but because we had both stood still in different ways. I felt the weight of unsaid words, not heavy enough to overwhelm, but heavy enough to remain. During this realization, English inexplicably came to my mind. I thought about how many things I struggle to say, even in my own language, how often I avoid precision to avoid discomfort. English suddenly felt familiar, not as a language, but as a mirror. It reminded me that clarity requires effort, that meaning does not appear unless you shape it. I realized that silence is also a language, and I had been speaking it for a long time. That realization did not ask me to fix everything. It asked me to understand, to see my role, to accept that waiting is a form of choosing. I didn't feel blamed. I felt responsible. Responsibility feels different when you accept it without defense. I stopped searching for the moment when everything went wrong. There wasn't one. There were many moments when I chose ease over presence, and ease slowly built distance. That understanding changed how I looked at time. Time does not disappear suddenly. It leaks quietly through postponed conversations, delayed honesty, and assumed closeness. I sat with that understanding for a while. I didn't rush to act or force reconnection. I allowed myself to feel the clarity. It was painful, but it was honest. I understood then why this felt like a lesson learned too late, not because it arrived after loss, but because it arrived after habit, after patterns had settled, after silence had become comfortable. That moment did not end the relationship, but it changed how I understood it. It showed me that closeness is not preserved by history. It is preserved by presence, and presence cannot be postponed forever. English stayed with me as that thought settled, not as vocabulary, but as awareness. The awareness that saying something imperfectly is better than saying nothing comfortably, and that clarity, even when awkward, is a form of care. I didn't yet know what I would do with this understanding, but I knew it had changed me quietly, permanently, and that change was preparing me for the final reflection, one that would not judge what happened, but would help me carry it forward with honesty and with intention. I used to think that regret arrived loudly. I believed it came with tears, with dramatic moments, with clear endings that announced themselves without ambiguity. I imagined regret as something overwhelming, something impossible to miss. But I learned that regret rarely does that. Most of the time, it arrives quietly. It sits beside you in ordinary moments while you are doing the dishes, while you are walking home, while you are staring at nothing in particular, lost in your own thoughts. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't shout. It reminds you of the moments you didn't take seriously because they felt small, moments that seemed too ordinary to matter. I learned that what we regret most is not what we did, but what we delayed. The words we assumed we could say later. The presence we believed would always be available. The connection we thought did not need attention. Looking back, I no longer blame myself. Blame suggests there was a clear warning, a moment when everything should have been obvious. There wasn't. Life rarely sends clear signals. It whispers, and whispers are easy to ignore when everything feels stable and familiar. I understand now that relationships do not ask for perfection. They ask for presence. Not all the time, but often enough to remind each other that the connection is still alive. I also understand why English began to matter after this realization. Not as a language to master, but as a reminder. A reminder that meaning requires effort, that clarity does not arrive on its own, and that silence, when chosen repeatedly, becomes a statement. English forced me to face discomfort, to search for words instead of avoiding them, to say things imperfectly rather than not at all. And that lesson reached far beyond language. I began to speak a little sooner, to ask a little deeper, and to pause before postponing. Not because I was afraid of regret, but because I understood its shape. Regret is not punishment, it is an instruction. It shows you where attention was missing, and where presence could have changed the outcome. I don't believe everything happens for a reason, but I do believe everything teaches if you are willing to listen. This experience did not make me wiser overnight. It made me more careful, more attentive, and more honest with myself. I stopped assuming that time would always be generous. I stopped treating closeness as guaranteed. I began treating it as something to be maintained gently. Over time, English became part of that practice. Not because it fixed anything, but because it asked me to be clear, to be intentional, and to stay, even when words felt uncertain. I learned that saying something awkwardly is often better than saying nothing perfectly. I learned that presence is not about grand gestures, but about showing up before distance becomes habit. If you are listening to this and thinking about someone you haven't spoken to in a while, I want to say this gently. You don't need the perfect moment or the perfect words. You only need the willingness to be present. Not everything can be restored, but many things can be softened, and softness matters. If English feels intimidating to you, if it feels like a barrier, perhaps it is offering you the same lesson. Not to be flawless, but to be brave enough to speak, to stay, and to connect. Language is not a test. It is an invitation to step into discomfort with honesty, and to replace silence with intention. I carry this lesson quietly now. I don't announce it, I practice it. In conversations, in pauses, in moments when it would be easier to wait. I try not to wait anymore. Not perfectly, but intentionally. The lesson I learned did come late, but it did not arrive too late because it changed how I live now. And that is enough. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening without rushing. And if you take one thing with you, let it be this: time feels generous until it isn't. Presence is how we honor it quietly, one moment at a time.